So this is a real moment where, once again, we're doing it. This is happening now. It's no longer a bunch of guys on podcasts talking about this happening. How do we make sure that we don't clench defeat from the jaws of victory? That we've come so far in actually getting to this very exciting moment where there is real movement, there is real demand, there's real price signals being sent by the market that new nuclear is extremely, extremely attractive. How do we make sure that this is different than the first nuclear renaissance? And how do we as a community and as a industry together work to make sure that we're learning from our mistakes rather than repeating them?
Warm welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by returning guest, James Krellenstein. Once, I think in our initial episode, James, I had to ask you, who the hell are you? Now I think you're pretty well known. You are the CEO of Alva Energy. And I think, again, partially through the Decouple podcast, pretty well and broadly known throughout the nuclear industry and beyond. We wrapped up an episode recently on the AP1000. It was really a technical deep dive, but it was part of an attempt at Decouple to understand the moment we're in and the moment that we came from, I guess, from the perspective of some of our earliest conversations on Decouple about the failures and successes of the initial nuclear build-out and what can be learned. So we're going to leap off of that first episode now that we really understand the reactor that a potential new fleet mode build-out involves, and that's the AP1000. I did a long episode with a couple of world experts, Michael Seeley, Yuri Humber, on that deal. I still can't say that I feel like I have a sharp understanding of it. But again, I think this is vitally important because, as I've been known to say, it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than to build a nuclear plant on budget and on time. We have an incredible opportunity here, and we have lots of opportunities to get it wrong. So let's, again, talk about what we can learn from best practices then and now. I'd like to look a little bit at the naughties renaissance, the renaissance of the early 2000s, the renaissance that wasn't. Look at the policy environment then and now to get a sense of, again, where we're at, what's in place, and again, what we can learn, how we can optimally take advantage of a historic moment to get a fleet of standardized giga-scale reactors built well. So James, welcome back.
Thanks. So I think, to start on this topic, it's really important for us to recognize, in the United States at least, some of the peculiarities of our utility industry. In particular, when almost all of the nuclear power plants that the United States built, with the exception actually of Vogtle, right? Remember, before Vogtle started construction, the last nuclear power plant to start construction in the United States that got completed at least was Sharon Harris Unit Number 1 down in North Carolina. That was actually in 1978, right? So the utility industry that was historically building almost every single nuclear power plant, actually including Vogtle, was in the regulated utility industry. So in the days before power, the sort of utility sector got deregulated, which meant that essentially these utilities acted as de facto geographic monopolies in their area, right? They would basically have a service area that was defined, and they actually were able to directly pass on the cost of both, operating the generating and transmission assets, but also directly pass on the cost of new capital construction, like a nuclear power plant, directly to the rate base. And those costs would be regulated by a public utility commission that would basically say, okay, these are prudent or non-prudent costs, or actually approve the cost of the actual initial capital project for a new nuclear power plant, let's say. And I think in addition to this, the nuclear industry in its heyday in the United States was not the naughties, not what we call, I guess you call the 2000s and 2010s, but rather actually the 1970s and 60s and the late 1950s. And I think it's really important when we think about the structure of a nuclear power plant, believe it or not, especially a US-based nuclear power plant, it's really important to actually understand the business environment and the utility industry upon which those nuclear industry vendors were building nuclear power plants into in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So let's pull back and think about that for one second. So a U.S. nuclear power plant is kind of weird in its own way because we have these sorts of, these plants that have a nuclear steam supply system, either supplied by Babcock and Wilcox, Combustion Engineering, Westinghouse Electric, or General Electric. But then we also have the entire balance of plant architecture, which is in general never provided by those companies, right? And that sounds really weird. Like there's no standardized design here. So you can literally have like Sharon Harris is a 3-loop Westinghouse PWR with a balance of plant engineered and designed by Abasco Services. And then you can go to Beaver Valley or North Anna, and you have a Westinghouse 3-loop, again, as a nuclear steam supply system with a balance of plant engineered and designed by Stone and Webster. And actually, when you think about what a nuclear power plant's capital structure is, the balance of plant is 50% of the cost, and the NSSS is about 50% of the cost, roughly speaking, right? And in fact, these differences go even deeper than what you would commonly think, right? It's not just the NSSS. Like literally the containment building is generally architected, at least historically, by what we call the architect engineer, not by like an Abasco, a Bechtel, a Stone and Webster, Black and Veatch, rather than it being designed by Westinghouse or GE or B&W. So you ask the question, why is that? And that has to do with that in the 50s and 60s and 70s, these nuclear steam supply system vendors, even that weird term, nuclear steam supply system or nuclear boiler system, they were trying to basically analogize directly to the model upon which the utility industry was used to in building fossil plants. So in fossil plants, you had a boiler supplier, a Foster and Wheeler, a Babcock and Wilcox, a Combustion. And then you literally had a balance of plant that was built around that boiler that would take fuel, take feed water, and return steam to a turbine generator, condensers, feed water heaters, all the electrical systems, the sort of ancillary BOP. And the initial idea of companies like Westinghouse and GE and B&W and Combustion is let's take that exact same business model that we have in selling boilers and extend that to nuclear power. Like we're going to build a nuclear boiler, and then we're going to leave it actually up to the utility themselves to figure out how we build the power plant around that boiler.
So what's wrong with that?
So it's a great question. What it does is it allows a lot of customization, and it allows these power plant, these utilities to sort of choose the vendors and choose the system design that they're most used to in their fleet. So if they like GE turbines or they like Westinghouse turbines, it allows them to select it. If they like a certain configuration of the feed water trains, it allows them to, the feed water heater trains, like it allows them to maybe have a deaerator or not have a deaerator, right? Even stuff like the aux feed water was customizable by the utility. But it also meant that essentially Westinghouse or GE wasn't selling a product. They were selling a component that was reliant on the vendor, on the utility, on the customer to make a product out of. Right. And that really made a lot of sense in the 1950s and 60s. We forget about how much there was an electric power boom in the 50s and 60s in that post-war period.
It was like China now, I guess, right?
It's like China now, right?
Yeah.
On average, in the 1950s and 1960s and before the oil shock, power use in the electric power use was doubling every 8 years. So that meant if you were a utility executive or a utility engineer, you were building coal power plants, maybe hydro, maybe oil power plants. Natural gas wasn't a huge part of generation back in there, but it certainly was in certain geographies, right? You were building enough power plants over and over and over again to literally double the amount of generation capacity every 8 years. So the amount of experience inside the utilities was massive. Even though we had this totally balkanized. We had thousands of independent utilities all across the country, right, that were, small in geography. Sometimes they would actually come together to actually form consortiums to build nuclear power plants. You think about, the Yankees up in New England, right, Vermont Yankee, Maine Yankee. These actually were built by consortiums that were put together of dozen or maybe a half a dozen or a dozen independent smaller utilities to pool their resources to deliver a power plant. Or out in Washington State, Washington Public Power Supply System, which was 60 or 65 different municipalities coming together to build a single unified platform to deliver it. But the idea here is that there was a lot of experience inside the utility industry to manage power plants, to do exactly that work. And in some cases, we talk about architects and engineers, right, that were coming as like Abasco Services or Bechtel. But in some cases, literally the utilities had enough experience that they did the architecture and engineering in-house. So think about a plant like 9 Mile Point Unit Number 1, which was actually like engineered by Niagara Mohawk. Salem Unit 1 and Unit 2, Public Service, PSEG actually was the architect engineer in that. Duke did the architecture and engineering on almost all their power plants and did the construction management as well when they actually were building the plant. So the actual capability inside these utilities was extremely, extremely sophisticated. And in some cases was large enough that they could actually function as their own architect engineer. Now, that worked really well in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and early 70s. Actually, if you were to argue what actually was the reason why you have some of these plants that hit it out of the park, right, in terms of cost in the early 60s and late 60s, it was really that organizational strength at the utility level was there. It might sound like a little bit of a historical discourse, like a digression, but I think it's actually really, really important to think about what this is and why that model worked really well in the 50s, 60s, and 70s doesn't really translate to the environment that we're in today.
So before we jump in and make that comparison to now,
Sure.
where I think in the U.S. it's safe to say, there's UAMPS, to some degree TVA involved in mPower and NuScale respectively, different arrangement. But before we jump there, just a couple of follow-up questions from what you were saying.
Go ahead.
This sort of bespoke architect and engineer to work around a boiler supplier, essentially, did that somehow work better for coal and not work for nuclear? Or again, was it just because it's happening in the 50s and 60s when, again, we're adding, doubling the grid every 8 years, and it doesn't matter if there's a lot of bespoke things because we're just so damn good at it?
I think, whether it worked or didn't work is sort of I think it did generally. We were able, once again, the lights stayed on in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, right?
Yeah.
We were doing exponential
Could we have built our
growth.
coal plants cheaper if we'd had standardized balance of plant, I guess,
Once again, if you have that capability in your utility organization, if you're Consolidated Edison Company in the 1950s or even Long Island Lighting Company in the 50s and 60s, just to give the answer of where I am in New York right now.
Or Ontario Hydro, if you're
or Ontario Hydro, to be honest with you, you were really very, very good at actually managing that sort of consumer, that sort of product integration aspect of it. You knew how your operating fleet, how the operators that you had, how they liked to operate the plant, how they liked their feed water system to respond.
Okay.
Think about it this way. Also, if you had a bunch of GE turbines and you had your own turbine techs that were used to dealing with Schenectady, experience with the General Electric sort of ecosystem, well, it would make sense, like an airline does today. Well, I'm actually going to build a lot more GE turbines, right? Just like I'm going to be a Boeing company versus an Airbus company on my long haul flights, right? There's actually some scaling that's going on in your maintenance operations where you could share that among the nuclear and non-nuclear fleet. And that made sense in a world in which you're just building so many power plants that, the average utility man or a woman, right, who was, well, probably not that many women, unfortunately, back in that time, right, was so experienced. Just think about what doubling time means every 8 years. That means in 24 years, you literally watched your fleet increase in generation capacity eightfold. right? 2 to the 3 is 8. Right? And that's an amazing amount of power that you've delivered in a short period of time, in 24 years. So it's like China to your analysis. So the capability of these organizations was just extraordinary. And as we noted, they kept the lights on, right? The power didn't go out.
With the surging demand.
With the surging demand. They were just meeting demand and building power plant after power plant. So that capability really was well exercised in the utility organizations.
And, as an example, in terms of the in-house expertise, Ontario Hydro, 40,000 employees for 40,000 megawatts. But 10,000 of those, is kind of a man per megawatt at the hour. Again, the lingo of the day. 10,000 of those employees were in the construction division. So the joke was, this is a construction company that happens to make electricity. So again, huge capacities, and that's a dramatically different environment today. Tell me a little bit about cost plus as a model that sort of fit that time, and potentially why that became a problem before we move on.
There's essentially 3 ways that you can, more than that, but let's just, for this discussion, kind of simplify it, right? There's you could imagine a construction or engineering project as, when you're working with an architect engineer and a vendor and a constructor, right? You can think about, there's a what we call a firm fixed price, or FFP contract, which basically says, I'm going to deliver the project for X dollars. And that's what I'm contractually guaranteeing to you. And I'm going to have milestones within my contract. When I hit this amount, you pay me this, you pay me that at each milestone. But when all is said and done, I am going to basically, the total sum of the amount of money I'm going to be paid is defined in the contract. And if I have to do more hours on engineering, if I have to do more procurement, that is basically up to me. Unless I get what's called a change order that is approved by the customer, I have to basically deliver the project for X dollars.
I take on the construction risk.
I take on the construction and engineering. I mean, if it's a full EPC firm fixed price, I'm taking on everything. I'm taking on engineering risk. I'm taking on procurement risk. I'm taking on construction risk.
So that used to happen. It doesn't happen anymore. We'll talk about the now soon, but
I think that you still see, you still see NSSS vendors actually willing to do sometimes their engineering and procurement scope actually firm fixed price
in the USA.
In the US, yes, on the NSSS, very clearly defined contractually. You see that, as I think we've talked a lot about. That's not necessarily where we've generally seen the cost overruns occur.
Yeah.
The other alternative on the other end of the spectrum is what we call T&M, or time and materials, and it's literally, the contractor, you pay them for the amount of time that the workers that they're hiring need to work on something, and you get billed every month or every quarter, and all the materials that they buy, they pass on the cost, generally with a guaranteed percentage of profit that they're making on the cost of the procurement, for example, that they're going through, and you basically are, you're paying a contractor essentially hourly. You can think of it that way, to basically finish the project and bring it on time. So that's T&M, or time and material.
Ultimately, the rate base in this old model is covering it, and the Public Utility Commission says this is a prudent cost. What the rate base can can cover this, and your
so there's an additional little wrinkle in here. So let's imagine on either firm fixed price or T&M, on the old regulated utility model, what we had, and to simplify it a little bit, is the capital cost of a project that was approved by the Public Utility Commission would be passed on to the rate base in a defined schedule. And if generally, as you noted, if those costs were deemed what's called prudent by the Public Utility Commission, not only did those costs get passed on to the rate base, they also got actually what's called a rate of return on those costs. The utility company would be able to profit on the costs that were passed. And that profit was actually, that percentage was defined by the Public Utility Commission. So it's generally on the order of 10 to 12%. So, and we'll get into this in a second, you can see here in some ways, one on the bright side, and I would argue this is a reason why, it really did encourage utilities to do capital expansion, right? It really said, we're going to mobilize capital and build more generation, build more transmission. Those are good things, especially in a time of exploding power demand. We're going to do that because not only are we going to, get through all the heartache of actually getting a new power plant built or a new transmission line built, but we're going to profit on that in a defined way. And as long as, and we have a sort of independent governmental regulator making sure that we're not going to town with this, and if they deem it prudent, well, then we're going to make some profit on that cost too.
I mean, occasionally this can be abused because it can be a malincentive to
Right. The downside is that, if the Public Utility Commission isn't, remember, the PUC can deem a cost not prudent, and therefore it's not necessarily deemed recoverable at profit. You don't get that 12%. Or in some cases, you're not even allowed to pass that on to the rate base. The utility itself needs to absorb that cost. So the idea here is that we have a strong independent governmental regulator that is regulating the costs that are going through. They have engineers that are looking through, and there's, if anyone has ever, hired people in who are of, have actually built things before, a huge amount of their actual work was often doing rate-based prudency hearings, right, and justifying to the Public Utility Commission why this cost was prudent or not prudent. But to your point, there was, especially starting in the 70s in nuclear projects, there was particularly on the regulatory side, you got into this situation where they found that if they could get the NRC to say that you needed something, right, or to delay the project, in fact, it's one of the surest ways to deem a cost overrun prudent is to say, well, the regulator required this, right, and therefore I had to do it, and therefore this change order or this cost overrun was absolutely prudent. So 12%,
my 10%.
Yeah, here's my 12% profit margin on this line, and I'm not spending any of this money. It's being passed to the ratepayer. And if you really get to know people who were involved in, especially in the late 70s sort of nuclear construction, early 80s nuclear construction, there are infamous stories of nuclear projects being brought on time and on budget. I won't tell you which, but where literally the project managers got fired essentially because the cost overruns were less than the utility had internally budgeted, and therefore the actual capital rate of recovery was lower than was anticipated.
Okay, James, so I think that's a pretty good grounding in the realities of the late 50s, 60s, 70s. Let's skip ahead a little bit to the naughty renaissance, as I call it. Looking at it at a very superficial level, this is starting in the early 2000s in the context of tight gas, not not being able to actually free up gas in tight formations, but highly volatile gas prices. Henry Hub hitting $13, I believe, in 2005, 2007, 2008, and even LNG import terminals being designed and partially built before eventually the fracking boom comes and they get turned around, reverse engineered into export terminals. But we had the first visit of a president to an operating nuclear plant since the 3 Mile Island accident when Jimmy Carter famously showed up. We have George W. Going to Calvert Cliffs and saying, very much endorsing nuclear energy. We need more of it. And I'm not sure if that's where the Energy Policy Act was unveiled, but a number of encouragement subsidies were made available, largely taken up by utilities in markets that were not merchant markets, that had not been liberalized, and real progress was made. And so when I look from the vantage point of our contemporary nuclear renaissance back at the early 2000s, the naughties, what I see, I think, is a much more serious environment. And maybe that's starting to flip now that we're talking fleet mode, AP1000s, 80 billion. We're going to try and coordinate this, line it up, standardize it. But let's time travel. Let's go in a little capsule back to the naughties and do a little maybe compare and contrast, or just an exploration of what was going on then.
So I think it's important here to recognize that, as you noted, there was a couple things going on at that point. First was there was genuine need, a belief that gas prices were very, very high. Coal, although abundant, even independent of its carbon emissions, was being correctly seen, I think, as a very large air pollution hazard, right? Just for respiratory diseases and others, right? That's a real thing and very, very dangerous. and coupled with it, 9/11 happened, right?
Yeah.
So the Middle Eastern oil nexus, that hydrocarbon nexus, that I think also in some cases was going to be thought of as an LNG source for gas from Qatar, for example, was not politically viable. And so we had sort of an idea here, hey, natural gas prices are kind of getting high. We can't really build coal. Oil production at that point we were a net energy, importer by a large amount, a net oil importer. And so we need to build nuclear in addition to other generation resources in order to effectively meet demand while, from a geostrategic perspective, being less reliant on the Middle East. And that, to your point, led to, I think, some very, very serious policy moves.
This was what I call a need-to-have moment, not a nice-to-have moment. Yeah.
So the first thing was the Energy Policy Act of 2005, as you noted, which really, among other things, to say it was just focused on nuclear, you could argue that a lot of actually the fracking revolution that occurred, the initial foundations, particularly on stuff like NEPA exemptions and Clean Water Act exemptions for small hydraulic fracturing, was built into that. That's the topic for another discussion, I suppose. But more importantly, a lot of the modern infrastructure that we today rely on for nuclear deployment in the United States, Loan Programs Office, I think it's called Office of Energy Dominance Financing, but it will always be LPO to me. The Loans Program Office was created in that legislative vehicle, as well as, I think, a real amount of money to basically start these designs through a collaboration called New Start, right, to really actually begin generating combined operating license under the Part 52 framework and to get design certifications for these designs. So the utilities came together, got a good amount of government funding, gave some of that to General Electric, where they drove through the ESBWR design certification, and part of it was driven to Westinghouse to build the AP1000 design certification.
Right.
In addition to this, you saw the French really align with Areva at the time, the Framatome, well, it would now be Framatome, Orano, and I guess some EDF assets, come together and actually join what's called Unistar Nuclear, aligned with Constellation, to, believe it or not, start thinking about building the EPR in the United States as well. So that's why you saw 9 Mile Point 3 EPR applications, Calvert Cliffs 3 EPR applications, Bell Bend, the outside of Susquehanna EPR, right? So we really also started seeing a lot of interest. We also saw Toshiba come in both through the ABWR and the Mitsubishi as well with the APWR, right? There was a lot of movement going on here, genuinely invested in the idea that we're going to need nuclear to meet load in a geostrategic way. That occurred.
Okay, noticeably, I'm not hearing about any SMR microreactor initiatives here. Maybe mPower, the integral pressures water from Babcock and Wilcox.
Well, mPower started as a joint venture between Babcock and Wilcox and Bechtel at the time, and B&W hadn't yet split to B&W and BWXT at this point. But it was a Bechtel B&W project that actually is very much in this time. But I don't think it was the view of the utilities that this was necessarily the defined winner here. I think there was genuinely, and although we talk about the fact that a lot of these plants were in regulated markets, a lot of the COLs were not. So South Texas Project 3 and 4, the actually only ABWR COLs ever issued in the United States, were obviously in a very deregulated market, ERCOT. So there was ideas here that we were going to be able to deploy this in 9 Mile Point 3, which started and finished. Obviously, NYISO is not a regulated market, right? Bell Bend is in PJM. right? So we could go down here, right? Same thing with obviously Calvert Cliffs. So there was a real idea here that actually with LPO in particular, there was going to be a way to finance this outside of a regulated market as well. And of course, if we think about it historically right now, although you have some people argue kind of oddly, Ted Nordhaus, for example, at Breakthrough argues all the time that you can't do this without a regulated market. Most nuclear power plants being built today, at least outside, ignoring China and Russia, if you think about in the UK, in Finland, these are being built in deregulated markets using, interesting financing structures in the United Kingdom or in Finland, Mancala model or some permutations thereof to actually deploy it not in a deregulated market. UK being the pioneers under Thatcherism of deregulation.
Right. And I guess what strikes me again about this moment is it feels like the 2025 Renaissance it feels very vendor driven. Sometimes utility partner like UAMPS, or I guess in the case of Empower, TVA, but not utility driven in the same way that the naughties are, where when we talk about getting these combined licenses, combined construction operating licenses, utilities are throwing hundreds of millions of dollars. Like I heard up to $500 million in terms of starting to, I guess, work with the vendors, help get the design ready, just walk through exactly what those hundreds of millions of dollars were spent on and how significant that is.
We can talk about this is just the COLs, right? Sure, and there was a good amount of federal funding coming in. In many of these cases, as the regulated utilities, they were able to pass those capital expenses for licensing onto the rate base, right? They were authorized to do so, and do capital cost recovery on it. So once again, from their perspective, this is actually, a profitable lot. It's a cost, but they're going to make some money on it, and it's going to require some support. There's a lot of federal funding here going on, but going back here, it wasn't just that they did it. We started construction. I mean, like Vogtle and Summer start in this process, right? It's out of this very, very clear process of New Start to basically really begin actually not just getting COLs, but proceed to construction. The difference, of course, is, how do you want to say this? The tail end of the nuclear build in the U.S. was a really tough time for utilities. You had entire utilities disappear, which, is as I think we talked about in our first episode, utilities are generally a very stable business. They're boring, for lack of a better term. And then you had companies like Long Island Lighting Company with building Shoreham disappear. It doesn't exist anymore. The state had to essentially nationalize it, create Long Island Power Authority, sell off the generating assets to Keyspan. You had, in the case of Public Service of New Hampshire, finishing up Seabrook, had the first investor-owned utility bankruptcy since the Great Depression. Right? You had huge amounts of controversy over nuclear power plants being built and finished with massive amounts of cost overruns occurring. You had Washington Public Power Supply System do the largest municipal bond default. You had Marble Hill in Indiana not ever get finished and get literally passed on the rate base, in a huge controversy there. The utility industry looked at nuclear power plants and watched all of them getting just ruined. Literally in some cases. So there was a real optimism at this time.
I mean, is that short memory? Because right now, with incredible incentives in place, like a investment tax credit, I believe up to 50% if you check the boxes of, what's it called? The labor, whatever you pay your tradespeople, local content, brownfield energy community, nuclear.
Through the Inflation Reduction Act and preserved through Big Beautiful
Bill. You're hitting
a
50% ITC. Like there's just
it's actually hard to hit 50% ITC right now, today's nuclear industry. But yes, 40%, 30%, whatever.
Juicy subsidies, right? But we're traumatized by, SCANA executives in jail over the VC Summer failure. So I guess in the early 2000s, had they suddenly forgotten, had a generation passed through and retired?
So I don't think they had forgotten. I think it was very much alive, actually. But what the industry and the government argued was, well, we've done very different things now. First thing is, from a regulatory perspective, we have Part 52.
Just briefly explain the relevance of that. We've talked about it before, but just quickly.
We've talked about this before, but basically one of the true historic drivers of regulatory cost overrun in the nuclear builds in the Gen 2 build out through the 70s, right, was the two-step or Part 50 licensing process that those initial plants were built under, which meant that you first applied for a construction permit. You got the permission to construct but not operate the power plant, which meant that the NRC actually, after you were done with construction, would have to turn around and say, we're granting you an operating license through what's called an FSAR, right? And there were multiple different ways where this was a really big problem. The first was, well, the NRC regulatory standards that the plant might have started construction under might be different than the ones that they finished construction under. So there are numerous examples of, millions, in some cases, billions of dollars of work that had to sort of be done, total systems destroyed and rebuilt because of the instability of the NRC process, and that there was literally regulations that simply did not exist when those systems were designed and constructed that in order for the plant to ever be allowed to operate would have to comply with. So you can understand why that was actually a huge problem. The second is that there was other components of the operating license that sometimes the NRC didn't explicitly control that could prevent the plant from being granted an operating license even when it was completely done. The famous example of this was Shoreham. Shoreham got completely constructed, actually began low power, went critical, actually went up to 5% power to do physics testing. And just because Mario Cuomo and Suffolk County, the county that it's in Long Island, refused to ever grant it a evacuation plan, which under the NRC regulations at the time required the local authorities to agree with it, was never granted an operating license and therefore never could, was shut down. And that multi-billion-dollar asset was passed on to the rate base of Long Island for, I think, still now. And this also happened again at Seabrook. Although the NRC actually overrode, they figured out a way to legally override the local Massachusetts and New Hampshire communities who objected it and actually forced the operating license to be issued over the objections of the local community, which took a lot of political will inside the NRC to do so. So those two things were real. You can look at utility executives saying we will never build another power plant under Part 50. Period. Right. End of story. This is just insane. So that leads to, in 1987, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission introducing Part 52, which basically says, instead of you guys, we're going to literally grant you the operating license before you ever begin nuclear construction. And what you need to basically demonstrate, and we're going to actually literally make rulemaking on this. We're going to literally make actually federal rules on how we're going to actually apply it. So we can't just change it willy-nilly afterwards. And this actually worked. They did not ever change it once they granted a COL. The NRC has never deviated from the COL it's issued. They literally said, you just need to prove through what are called ITACs, inspections, test, analyses, and acceptance criteria, that you built the plant as the operating license said you did. And if you just do that, you get what's called a 103G letter under 10 CFR 52-103G that says you've built the plant in conformance with the license, load fuel. And it doesn't even require the commission itself to grant it.
This is a brief explanation of Part 52, but it is important. It is important.
Is it long? I'm sorry. I apologize.
It's okay. I think you've hit the points. Yeah.
But I think understanding the weird context of where we've gone through in the history of this 80-year industry in the United States is really important to understand where it's going now.
100%. And we're going to get to where it's going briefly. But again, just to reaffirm, Part 52 is a big thing for utility executives in the naughties and the early 2000s to say, hey, the fundamentals of how these things get built, we've de-risked them with things like Part 52. And now we have like a production tax credit through the Energy Policy Act. We have a supportive federal government. We have a real driver here because the price of natural gas is going through the roof. We can't build coal.
We have a way to access incredibly low-cost financing. We forget that in a nuclear power plant, capital costs can be sometimes the biggest component of the construction cost of a nuclear power plant. Like, just imagine if the cost of capital goes from 6% to 9% in a nuclear power plant build, and even if everything underneath it, what we call the overnight cost, the plant's the equipment, the labor, everything else remains the same, the cost of the plant increases by 50%. So what LPO did is basically say, energy dominance financing literally said, well,
EDF.
we're going to give you essentially financing at what the U.S. government basically borrows money at. So about 37 basis points above a 30-year treasury bill. Right. So like, if you think what the U.S. government borrows money at, that's a 30-year T-bill. We're going to be at 37 basis points, at 0.37% higher than that. So a real way. And Vogtle, of course, took $12 billion out in near, close to half of the total cost of that plant was actually financed by LPO at very, very low cost of capital. Relative to historically, what you would have to be doing is issuing bonds at very, very high interest rates to basically finance the build out you're doing it. The second thing that happened at the state level was a lot of states passed bills that allowed the plants to pass the cost of construction even before operation directly onto ratepayers, so that you weren't paying interest, or at least paying the interest down, to basically recover those nuclear construction costs while the construction was underway. So South Carolina is the infamous example of this with VC Summer 2 and 3, where the ratepayers were paying constantly for the construction of the plant, even though it never finished. And hopefully it will finish, of course, in the future.
And they did not access the loan guarantee through the energy policy.
SCANA and Santee Cooper did not, actually, interestingly.
And so they wanted it later when costs spiraled, but at that point.
But Southern Company, in Southern Company, let me just be clear, these were, I believe, Georgia Power. I'm actually not sure if Georgia Power, MEAG, or the city and the cities. I don't remember the exact capital stack, but a good amount of the ownership was issuing bonds. And it should be clear, these are bonds that pledge the company first, right? They're essentially corporate bonds that then LPO is guaranteeing. So in order to trigger that LPO guarantee, generally the company would have to, or the muni would have to default first.
And to be very clear, that loan guarantee money paid through by the LPO to Vogtle, that $12 billion, is being paid back. It's not any kind of grant.
Yeah. In fact, it's actually, if you talk to LPO, it's probably the safest thing right now in their portfolio, right? The U.S. government, the U.S. taxpayer is making a profit, essentially, de minimis, but a profit on the Vogtle loan guarantees. Indeed.
Okay, so to bring us up to the present, I don't think we need to belabor this massively, but in terms of what snuffs the naughty renaissance, shale gas comes online, Fukushima, supply chain screwed up, energy market liberalization. What are the main factors? And again, we'll do this in like 5 minutes or something.
I think you can't underestimate shale here, right? The fracking revolution dramatically transformed the United States energy system. I mean, there's no way to say on both the hydrocarbon, on both the petroleum and the natural gas side of things, this was a revolution, and that's the right way. If you look at just, the fact that we were at 50% coal for power in 2006, and we're at less than 25% now. I don't know the exact number. I think it's actually less than nuclear now is what coal is. And just to be frank, that is primarily being driven by cost, right? Mm-hmm. That it's actually just much easier to have a combined cycle natural gas plant generating that than operating and running a coal power plant. Now, there's exceptions here where it is environmental or, public health concerns that are causing the shutdown of the coal plants as well, and natural gas coming in to fit it. But so that revolution where you said, how are we going to do baseload? Well, now we can do baseload by burning natural gas. So that's really a huge revolution.
Would you, in a hypothetical here, absent the shale revolution, do you think we would have struggled through Vogtle and Summer and learned the lessons and kept going because we didn't have another choice?
Yeah, I think that's like, once again, this is all economics, right? I mean, you can't underestimate this, right? Yeah. It's really, really, how do I want to say this? It's really hard if you're in South Carolina, where you're building 2 gigawatts and you realize that you can get 2 gigawatts of a packaged combined cycle plant and natural gas prices are pretty cheap. And then you're watching, or you're at Florida Power and Light, and you're saying, I have a license to build Turkey Point 6 and 7, or I could build a couple of combined cycle plants outside of Fort Lauderdale. and it not only not be a national news story, it'll just be a very easy thing to get done. I mean, you can imagine if you're in the utilities boardroom trying to justify, this might be a 10-year slog. We're going to have to build an entire organization to deliver this project. And at the end of it, we're getting 2 gigs. And it's going to be probably more expensive than a combined cycle gas plant. You can imagine what's going on in their heads at that point.
Right. Fukushima seems like more of an excuse than a driver for a lot of these utilities to abandon their combined operating licenses and plans.
I think every single COL of the 18 gigawatts that were issued after Fukushima Daiichi. Right.
Wow.
So in fact, Greg, there was a delay at the NRC by about, I would say, 8 to 11 months of them, making sure that the COLs were okay, right? Which I think was overly conservative, but once again, it did delay certainly Vogtle and Summer's COL issuance. I don't believe there was any that got issued before Vogtle and Summer, Fukushima. And we lucked out in some ways in that the primary, accident sequence that we had at Fukushima Daiichi, which was a station blackout, the new designs are very, very good at handling. Both ESBWR and AP1000, as we talked about before, don't require any emergency diesel generators to not only safely shut down, but to even experience every design basis accident. So yes, that was part of it, but I think it is true that in the utilities defense, if you imagine in their situation, public support for nuclear energy did drop very significantly after Fukushima. Yeah. So, in the roster of the pros and cons that you're writing in your board meeting, public support really did switch, very measurably.
We interrupt your regular programming for an appeal from our sponsors. That means you, hopefully. Decouple runs on a strange fuel mix. World-class guest experts and a talented editorial and production team. One of these is not free. If you want more long-form, numerate, and historically informed exploration of nuclear energy, geopolitics, and climate change, you can help in a few very concrete ways. Upgrade to a paid subscription. Join us on Substack, and think of this as buying a small equity stake in independent nuclear journalism. You can also make a tax-deductible donation on our website through our fiscal sponsor. You can find the button again on our Substack site. If you are a utility, a vendor, fund manager, or policy type who reads this work, support it like you would any other research product. If Decouple informs your decisions, help fund the next episode that saves you from a bad one. If you value having at least one outlet that treats nuclear as an engineering and industrial project, not as vibes-based asset class, please consider paying for it. Financial independence is what guarantees editorial independence, and it is what makes Decouple so special. Thanks again for listening to this message. Now back to the regular programming. Understand, I think another key ingredient to why this all falls apart, they can go listen to the 4-part series, What Went Wrong at Vogtle, to understand, how badly the supply chain happened to manage this and sort of the promises and perils of modularity when your supply chain is maybe a Chicago Bridge and Iron oil and gas supply chain.
We don't need to belabor this that much.
We do not need to belabor that. But also, we're also seeing Oikoloto starting, Flamanville starting, and I think we have, not just within the U.S. and maybe preceding the U.S., we have sort of construction calamities starting to percolate in Europe. But anyway, let's leave that aside because I want to use our remaining time to answer this question. We've framed ourselves historically. Again, our earlier conversation, I guess probably 2.5 years ago, looking at the future of nuclear energy. I think we were looking at and probably advocating an approach of a standardized fleet deployment of something like the AP1000 or maybe the ABWR. We're now in that policy environment. It's there's the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I think the intentions there, we'll see what the actual process of pursuing this policy is. But let's try and learn from the past and lay out what an ideal policy would look like in terms of coordinating that supply chain. We have the policy incentives that we do, but how do we not screw this up? How can the camel pass through the eye of the needle with grace?
We have to go back to one of the more interesting aspects of the Generation 2 build out, which was, okay, there were real failures. We always talk about the real failures, but we don't talk about the real successes. We talk in our company about, there's this sort of case control study that we always love to talk about, which is, St. Lucie 2 gets built. It's one of the most successful builds in the history of the U.S. nuclear industry. Post 3 Mile Island, or at least mid 3 Mile Island, I guess, has all the issues that are associated there. It's one of the latest plants to start, all under NRC, right? The construction permit is only issued in 1976. There's no nuclear construction that exists under the AEC, right? Everything is done through the NRC. And 5 years from nuclear construction to cold hydro, right? Really, really quick, relatively speaking, under budget actually, compared to what it was supposed to be. And then that's, a plant built by combustion engineering. It's a combustion engineering reactor built by ESBWR. And then the exact same year, you have a combustion engineering plant built by ESBWR, designed by ESBWR, starting out in Washington State. It's called Washington Nuclear Project 3. And that leads at the exact same year, exact same regulatory environment, built with the exact same reactor technology and the exact same constructor and engineer. And that leads to the largest municipal bond default in U.S. history until Detroit collapses in the exact same environment. And you ask yourself, okay, I'm missing something here. How can two projects that look like they should be identical, one fail and one be one of the largest failures of the nuclear industry, and one be arguably the greatest success of the nuclear industry by the late 70s.
So we have you love your case control studies here.
Well, I think it's a good empirical way to think about if my mental model of how these things work is empirically supported.
And you can test a number of variables, but there's so much that's similar here. So what is the the explanatory variable?
The difference really is what we call the developer organization that actually deploys these plants. Right, Bill Derrickson at St. Lucie and his colleagues at ESBWR built a hybrid organization of ESBWR and FP&L in every single sort of domain, such that the utility built a couple hundred people organization to deliver new nuclear power plants for FPL on time and on budget. And Washington Public Power Supply System had never built a power plant ever before.
Wow.
Or a thermal power plant.
Okay.
With maybe the exception.
All hydro.
Well, I actually don't think Whoops even itself had generally built hydro before.
Okay.
I think actually, it had built the balance of plant N reactor, which is the graphite moderated weapons reactor that actually was making 800 megawatts of power for the grid. But that's another story for another time. That's sort of an American RBMK, as a safer American RBMK for weapons plutonium production at Hannaford site.
Right.
But they basically had almost no organization running that.
Okay.
So if you compare that difference, that makes all of the difference. And actually, if you extend this analysis out, you find that this generally actually is the single greatest variable that is imperative to nuclear project success. The quality of the organization at the customer level matters because we forget that we're dependent on the customer to make a nuclear power plant a product. Right? The ability to take the NSSS, integrate it with a balance of plant, managing your supply chain, managing your architect engineer, managing T&M, managing all the sort of change orders, all of that, the organization that should be most financially incentivized to reduce those costs is ultimately the customer. The problem is that the U.S. industry, the utility industry that we had, was not set up for scaling that org. So think about FPL. It built St. Lucie 2. It never built another nuclear power plant. Even though that organization delivered it, there's no ability for that org to slide along and deploy a power plant in, I don't know, Mississippi or something, right? Or Texas or New York, right? That organization where all that living lives didn't actually ever work, didn't ever get its chance to build another nuclear power plant. And that's why our organization and other organizations are developers, right? We believe that the central problem in the U.S. nuclear industry in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, right, really was, in fact, the fact that the organizations that could get very good at nuclear power plant builds, one, weren't allowed by the geographical structure of utilities in the U.S. to slide along and actually build the next one. And two, would generally demobilize if they built one or two or three reactors. Even if by the third reactor, they were doing fantastically. Think about Arizona Public Services project organization, developer organization that delivered Palo Verde, right? Palo Verde 3 was probably 70% cheaper than Palo Verde 1. And yet that organization never built another nuclear power plant ever again. And if
Right.
you contrast this to, everyone talks about France, right? In the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Well, France was really actually had an organization that was building through EDF, through Electricité de France. They were just building the plants dozens of times over and over again. So that same organization was really sliding along, building the change control infrastructure. And, it's not true that the regulatory requirements in France, as you can imagine, in the 70s and 80s, were that much lower than what they were in the United States. In fact, you could argue they were quite higher, in fact, and there's certain weirdness there, which we could get into. But that really is the structural change that needs to occur. And it didn't need to happen in the 60s and 70s. Why? Because in the 60s and 70s, just every utility itself generally had an incredibly good organization on delivering power plants because they needed to basically double their generation capacity every 8 years. So the idea of a developer organization that sat outside of the utility was kind of ridiculous. They just did it in themselves. That doesn't exist today. Arguably, we're in a much weaker position than we even were in the 2000s and the naughties, right? And that's, if you look at one of my biggest concerns, is it's the lack of a developer orgs that are actually going to really be able to competently deliver these projects.
Especially when we're talking about eight AP1000s. Just briefly, in our pre-recording conversation, you'd made, I think this really drives home the importance of the owner in keeping cost under control, and that key difference between WOOPS and Florida Light and Power. And you had this analogy of doing a renovation on your kitchen. Ben Fleevberg, in his book How Big Things Get Done, he often makes, and Dan Gardner as well, they often make this analogy to help the lay reader understand mega project management, a renovation of one's kitchen. So maybe you could just give us that analogy to drive that home.
I mean, I'm not sure a kitchen renovation is, obviously this is something that's 1,000 times or 1,000,000 times, literally, sometimes more complex than a kitchen renovation. Right. I want to just emphasize this one point, that, building a nuclear power plant is not like buying a product. I mean, the analogy of thinking about it as a product is, you go to Westinghouse and say, it would be like if you went to a Chevy dealer and you said, I would like to buy a car, and Chevrolet says, that's great. I make the engine. And I have defined battery limits about which I'm allowed to basically say, and there's other people who can help you build a chassis, but, we have some recommendations, but we don't really get involved in chassis build. And if you want seats, well, there's some other people who build seats, right? And we don't provide any financing, so you guys have to assemble this together. So it really is like building a power plant is much more like a kitchen renovation than buying a car, though I want to be mindful of not
sure,
overly simplifying this process. Yeah. And the difference is if you gave basically the keys to your house, basically, send me a bill at the end of month and I'll check in, once a week, see how you guys are doing, versus I'm going to have an entire team that is supervising you, that is monitoring you, that is checking every bill, that is making sure that the tile and the tile grout I select for the kitchen is proper, is going through the designs. You can imagine which project is going to get better or which project is going to get worse. And the problem is that when building a nuclear power plant, it's not like having, your mom or your wife, hounding the contractors or the husband. It is literally like, this is a very complex endeavor that's going to take dozens and dozens of employees to do correctly. And I think one of the biggest worries that I see is that we have a bunch the institutional memory for building nuclear power plants has gotten much, much weaker than it was in the 2000s. And even worse than that in some ways is that the utility projects organizations on the nuclear side have been very severely weakened. Because although we talk about the fact that we stopped new nuclear construction in the late 2000s, the other thing is a lot of nuclear power plants shut down. And so, because they were just economically not competitive against gas and in some cases renewables, so they literally, the organizations of the power plants that did survive were cut to the bone. So major capital projects basically got eliminated. And in many cases, the entire sort of nuclear division of the company ceased to exist because the plant got shut down and literally sold off to a undertaker, as I call them, a decommissioner like Holtec or like, SDS or something like that literally said, utility, wash your hands of this. We're going to build an entire org here to do the decom. Right. So we shan't understate that the industry is in a weaker place today than it was in the 2000s.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit more about sort of who are the champions. We are the champions, but who is going to lead this? Because as you mentioned in the 60s and 70s, in the heyday, in the early 2000s, in the naughties, utilities were leading the charge, willing to take some risk. They thought that the policy environment had been fixed. They had confidence. Obviously, Vogtle and Southern was a real... Summer, yeah, it was a real kind of slap to the face and put pause in utility executives. And I think, this is something that Jigar Shah has kind of bemoaned is like, guys, LPO is offering, incredible candy bars. No one wants to come and take a nibble. And so what we've had is more sort of vendors, maybe billionaires leading projects, trying to get government to sort of backstop risk, get them built and maybe sell power to utility. But the utility is not saying, hey, I'm the owner, I'm going to build this thing. It's more sort of, well, I'm not going to take the risk. I'm just going to have a power purchase agreement and an offtake agreement. That's fundamentally different. But what I think is the sort of semi-breaking news is the U.S. government now saying, reportedly, I think according to Bruce Flatt, like the government's going to own these plants.
Without betraying any confidence of friends in the government, I think that there's different views on this depending on if you're listening to the Department of Energy or the Department of Commerce, and I'll leave it at that. But I don't think that this would look like the U.S. government as the majority owner. Maybe I think what Commerce had talked about was that 10% maybe of the plant would be owned by it, so it wouldn't be operated or developed by the U.S. government.
So who is the champion then? Is it the utility? Are the utilities incented? We've heard, again, Jigar Shah saying what the utilities need to do this is cost overrun insurance. He, I think, ridiculously said the Canadian government should supply that cost overrun insurance for their local champion, the Westinghouse Electric.
So I worry that cost overrun insurance is a bizarre argument.
Malincentive?
Well, because... What exactly is cost overrun insurance? Well, if it's in its most simplest form, right? It is a pot of money that is sitting out there that presumably, is not shared completely by the project participants, right? Otherwise, that would just be project, the regular financial structures of which we finance a project, right? Insurance implies that there is an insurer who is giving that money. And if you just think about this from the most basic perspective, well, if you're a project participant and see, well, there's a way to get 50% of the cost of the project covered or 25% of the cost of the project covered by someone else, that doesn't necessarily disincentivize you from trying to get that 25% of the cost, especially if you're, let's say, an EPC, right, who realizes, oh, that's going to be more billable hours for me, right? And so a cost overrun insurance being spoke about by Jigar without actually any sort of backing of it, it may make sense from someone who thinks that a nuclear power plant is as easy to build as a wind or solar project. But for those of us who are, understand this industry better than to make that statement, would like to see those people advocating for such a solution to actually put some meat on the bones of it, rather than using it as I think, a kind of a great Twitter fodder rather than any concrete policy. And look, I understand if spent a couple of years sort of saying SMRs are the only way to go forward and recognize where the industry is now.
Right.
But I think you're bringing up a better point, and in defense of Jigger, and it's a good point. Okay, great. LPO is out there. LPO is a very slow process, but sure. Where is it? Where are the orders at this point?
With a much more generous subsidy package than the Energy Policy Act of 2005. Like these, again, investment tax credits are pretty enormous. So we're offering the candy, the utilities aren't coming. How does that get incented in this era now of we're going to build 8 AP1000s? Who's going to go first? You said this is going to be just the government owning it and doing this. A utility has to lead and take the risk.
Or a developer has to be able to build it, which means they have to finance it. So that's a complex endeavor.
The developer doesn't have a rate base in case things go wrong, to my understanding. So how does that make any sense?
I mean, hypothetically, a developer can develop this like all the independent power producers who built the vast majority of natural gas that is powering 50% of the country now.
But then those natural gas plants didn't come with like insane construction risk.
Right. Well, so that's exactly the issue here. And I think that but once again, that was financeable, right? And we did see project finance. I think our perspective, I'm speaking as Alva now, is that, one of the things that we've learned, and this is an odd statement, but it's that, the reason why we aren't bankable right now, I mean, a $15 billion project, there's tons of projects that get financed for $15 billion, right? There's huge amounts of capital. If you think about what the new data centers that are being done, they're blocked, but the total project capital cost is sometimes larger than what we generally are seeing for a new nuclear project. Or think about even a silicon like a foundry or a fab, right, that is used to make microprocessors or semiconductors. These are often more than $15 billion and are financed off the market. The question goes exactly to your point, is how do you actually get assured that the organization that you're going to be actually deploying this capital with is not going to have insane cost overruns or construction and completion risk? I think our perspective, as you know, is that the industry itself needs to start demonstrating that they are able to deploy power in a realistic way, on a project financeable way. And that's why we are focused on power uprates initially, right? We think that the idea that you're going to create, even if you have a 100 or 200 person organization backed by a couple $100 million in venture, right? It's going to be actually really hard to finance that money, I think with good reason, if that project hasn't deployed anything before. But we have a really good scaling strategy that exists, which is that we have gigawatts and gigawatts of power that need to be tapped out of uprates. Let's get an organization that demonstrates it can do that literally is, has training wheels before they basically take $15 billion of project risk. That's our approach. Now, how do we get this in the US? I think, just to be frank, the first couple projects are going to be built by your big utilities, right? Or by a government-backed, like maybe New York, NYSERDA comes in and says, we're going to be paying $155 a megawatt hour. We're going to go to some utility that maybe operates in upstate New York, and we're going to basically give them a lot of financing ability. So I think to basically weather a lot of cost overruns. But I think it's a real question here.
Do you think any utilities are going to come to the board? Again, we were a little harsh on Jigger there, but like if they don't have some
Jigger. I'm joking with Jigger. I mean, it's out of love. Like, the issue here is it's a genuine issue that Jigger is bringing up, which is, okay, great.
Yes. So how do we solve that? How do we get a utility to step up and build the first AP1000 since Vogtle and Summer?
I think the key thing here, if I'm honest, if we want to go straight to building an AP1000 right now, is you got to have a counterparty that is highly, highly creditworthy, that is going to put the power prices at a strike price that is high enough to not just build an AP1000, but build that AP1000 with significant cost contingency.
Yeah.
That is what is going to be necessary, or some other form of financial support, whether that is a cost overrun, whether that is not cost overrun, but some sort of way to actually say there's actually a counterparty here that I don't destroy my company's balance sheet.
there's some talk of, listen, if we're going to build 8 of these, the first couple are going to be more expensive. That's not fair for the first utility to jump first. So the later entities should have to pass some financing along.
Yeah, I would caution everyone on that logic, and only because we've done this before, and no investor after a multi-billion-dollar cost blowout after Unit 2 says, well, let's try Unit 3. I mean, and we've tried this in multiple different ways, right?
Okay.
Washington Public Power Supply System was building 5 units with the idea of eventually building 25. SNUPS was building 5 units with the eventual idea of building dozens more on a standardized developer basis. When Wolf Creek and Callaway went over budget and Callaway 2 got canceled, the other 3 plants that were licensed never got even started construction, Sterling and those plants, right? So it can't be. The idea here is we need a developer organization that has been able to demonstrate competence. You need to be able to demonstrate competence before you start a large light water reactor build. And what does competence mean? It means delivering additional nuclear megawatts on time and on budget to your financing partners and your off-taker partners before you take a $15 billion credit risk.
Sounds a little bit like Ontario here. We have a refurbishment program. We're crawling. We're doing some partial new builds in Romania.
I think that what Eric Chazard is doing at Bruce is exactly the model, right? It is literally and Renchek before him, right? It is literally, what is the model? It is, we are going to do extensive refurb and power uprates at Bruce A and Bruce B. And when those are all done, we're going to turn over that entire organization that is hot, that has had real world experience in doing this, and build Bruce C. That is precisely the model, because no one is looking at that and saying this organization has never done it. This organization has done 8 refurbs, and I know you love the can-do, but basically the problem with the can-do is that every 20 years you have to rebuild the fucking thing.
Okay, not 20.
What? Or whatever. 40?
Take rigs after 40, 30,
fine,
35.
40. But for exactly the problem that we're in right now, that's exactly what we want to do. We want to have that organization, and Bruce, you can see it is getting better at each refurb, right? They have an entire, we've been there together. I've seen it independently. They have an incredible project control organization at Bruce that is run by Bruce Power, right? They have an internal design and procurement organization that is done. They have the craft on site, to the fact that you can't get a place to eat in the disgusting plant cafeteria. No offense to the Bruce, I'm sure they work very hard. I know it's rural. I'm just kidding around. But you can literally not get a seat to sit because the plant has so many people doing real world nuclear construction. And that exact model that is being prototyped in Bruce is exactly the model that Alva is trying to recapitulate. And I think a lot of other people who are smart about this is saying, let's literally build a projects org. Let's do some stuff that actually is getting power onto the grid. So when you go to Park Avenue and you say, I need PE financing for a couple $1 billion, well, that's an organization that has proven its snuff, right? It's proven its ability to learn, to get better, to deploy new projects before it does that then.
Okay, so we're still talking from the perspective of, building 1 or 2 of these plants. How would we finance that?
I think at that point, when you have that developer organization, like Bruce C is going to build 4 of reactors. We won't say which type, but yeah.
Yeah. So, but talking about 8, so the question comes up, okay, if we're going to build 8, we have long lead items. We've got to, start procuring, especially if there's, haste to, power the AI superintelligence monster. So why don't we start warehousing parts? Why don't we start, getting all these steam generators ready and reactor pressure vessels ready? Maybe, I'm not sure if the French were doing this at Crusoe or something like that, but why don't we do something similar to have this stuff stockpiled? Like, what else can a kind of MAGA central planning do to facilitate not just the construction of 1 or 2 reactors, but really prepare and commit to 8?
So I think that
I like MAGA central planning.
Yeah, exactly. The GOS plan of anyway. So I think that to be honest, I think early long lead procurement items is a very smart idea. I think it can be incredibly useful, and it can be incredibly dangerous if not done right. Right? If you think about what happened at Vogtle as an example, I don't think the actual argument here is that Southern didn't place the orders early enough. Southern placed a lot of these orders actually, and for Summer too, before actually the operating license was even before the COL was even issued.
Wow.
Procurement started in fabrication, at least the orders, the POs went out way before then, sometimes 2 years before then, right? But it was that the organization ultimately that was controlling, to go back to the St. Lucie whoops example, take the example of the core makeup tank. We talked about the core makeup tank in the last episode. Well, the core makeup tank is in fact a pretty simple thing, actually. I mean, not simple to fabricate, but it's basically a empty tank with a cylinder with two hemispheres on top of it and a pipe jetting out, and two pipes jetting out, and instrumentation, of course. But one of the things that happened, just to give you an example of this, is that was made by now a Westinghouse subsidiary called Maserati in Italy. These were shipped out from Italy to, obviously, over the oceans, Port of Savannah, railed up to the plant. And when they got to the plant, someone realized the volume of the core makeup tanks was wrong. It just simply wasn't fabricated with the right dimensions. And literally, that core makeup tank had to be reshipped to Maserati, fixed, and then reshipped back. Now, there are people who we can talk about, right, who are wondering, well, why wasn't there a utility representative in the plant that measured the volume then? And I think this goes back to, one of the things that I am a little bit concerned about is, if you think about procurement structures, people thought, and that procurement structure for Vogtle and Summer was, in fact, a firm fixed price procurement structure.
Okay.
But that is not like just, ordering something from Amazon, right? It says, it's $29, I'm going to order it, and it'll show up on my doorstep 2 days later. The way that if you think about how steam generator replacements are done, if you think about major capital projects are done in this industry that are done well and done in record time, it is done by organizations having representatives, in some cases living at the factories, that are double and triple and quadruple checking everything. And that is a really, really important aspect of this. I mean, one of the many things that are going on. So one of the things that worries me about an advanced procurement structure is that's great, but how are we going to make sure that that core makeup tank is the right dimensions, or that the weld quality is right? Having actual owner quality QA, we know that's one of the major lessons that we have of the Gen 2 build out and of the Gen 3 build out. And if you now are actually decoupling that from an actual utility or employer or actual site, then you get into a pretty large problem.
And again, this is the equivalent of handing over the house keys to the contractors renovating a kitchen, taking off for 6 months to the Caribbean.
But or maybe this is like, and I don't mean to sound too small c conservative here, but I think this is a fair point. It would be like that, and then also having the cost of the cabinets. The cabinets are actually going to be made and paid for by U.S. taxpayer dollars, or backed by U.S. taxpayer dollars, and the owner of the house hasn't even decided whether or not they want to renovate the kitchen, but they're going to have someone else pay the craftsman to make the cabinets, right? And you can imagine, well, those cabinets, ultimately you're not going to have, I remember when my mom was doing when we were doing a kitchen renovation, my mom was, every day with the ruler and like literally in the, yelling and screaming and saying, this is wrong. And thank God she did that, because, that's why it wasn't a disaster of a renovation. Right. But now imagine, in fact, you have, now that doesn't mean you shouldn't do this. I don't mean to be sounding a Debbie Downer here at all. It's still a good idea to have those cabinets waiting in a warehouse, and having someone else pay for it at a low interest cost is even better. But you have to be careful about how you do this to not repeat the lessons that we're doing.
So, James, we've talked about this idea of building 8 AP1000s, and it raises the natural question. The AP1000 at Vogtle had a fairly globalized supply chain, taking advantage of heavy forging. I'm not sure if it was Korea or Japan. Should the U.S. or can the U.S. Revitalize its capacity to make heavy forgings for RPVs and steam generators, et cetera? Is that something that's atrophied and gone now? What's the state of the U.S. supply chain?
Yeah. So I think, first of all, just pulling back for 1 second, I think this is all very, very good news, right? I mean, we are seeing one of the few moments of bipartisan continuity in this country right now is that President Biden, I think, was very pro building new reactors and committed, I think, to like tripling nuclear capacity. And now,
200, baby.
yeah, and now the Trump administration is continuing that very good policy.
400.
And arguably being even more aggressive, and I would argue maybe even more effective, to be honest with you, and putting much more sort of skin in the game than the Biden admin did. And that's exactly what we want to see. And, you know, I want to address directly sort of how we can make this work better, because I think it's a really solid foundation that we're working on. But then I'll address, you know, your direct questions maybe first. So yes, right now, the heavy forging components, so that's reactor pressure vessel, pressurizer, steam generators, they can't actually really be made right now in the United States, right? So if you think about what happened at Vogtle, right, we made most of those heavy forgings at Doosan in South Korea, or actually at Monterrey in Italy, pressurizer, that sort of thing. Actually, I'm not sure where the forgings, I don't know if Monterrey actually did the forgings, but they certainly did the assembly of core makeup tanks, accumulators, pressurizers, and then Doosan did the RPV and steam generators and reactor vessel head. And that supply chain, I mean, you know, if you think about where we built the RPVs in the US, they're primarily done at Combustion Engineering in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And that's actually for Westinghouse and GE, as well as combustion plants. Believe it or not, Westinghouse or GE could never actually do their own RPV forgings. And then it was also done at Mount Laurel, Indiana, by Babcock and Wilcox. I think it's Mount Laurel. It's somewhere in Indiana. It's Mount something in Indiana, and that was for both B&W and I believe GE and Westinghouse plants. Now, actually, even in the 70s and 80s, we saw companies like Rotterdam Dry Dock in the Netherlands start doing RPV assembly, as well as French contractors and forges really work on this forging and the welding associated with this. So even then, it was a slightly globalized supply chain. BWXT's facility now in Indiana is fully dedicated, my understanding is, to actually producing the kit for the nuclear navy. And the Chattanooga facility is long, unfortunately, gone. It actually got retaken over actually in the nuclear renaissance, believe it or not, to make the Arabelle steam turbines by the French, by Alstom. And unfortunately, that plant never got an order. I'm sorry, it's actually not very funny, but that plant never actually got even an order and is now long gone. I don't know what it is now. So right now, the U.S.'s supply of these components is for the heavy forging, which is a small percentage of the total cost of a new nuclear power plant, is basically dependent completely on foreign suppliers. Personally, I am of the opinion that we should not wait till we have an indigenous supply chain to start on the AP1000 build program. You know, we have highly competent international suppliers that are allies of the United States. France, Spain can do stuff. Italy can do stuff. Japan and South Korea can do this as well. And to be honest, this is a story of technology transfer boomeranging back, right? We were the ones who initially seeded that technology into France, into Japan, into South Korea. And it's time now that those sorts of plants that we seeded now are going to seed it back to the U.S. nuclear renaissance. And I would like to see that sort of boomerang happen because I think it would be very interesting. I think there's some policy that can help support that, but we shouldn't delay the build of these plants until we have those, domestic supply chains set up.
So just briefly going back to first principles, forging, you're taking a big ingot and just hammering the shit out of it with something that's 15,000 tons, 50,000 tons.
Not 50,000, but yes.
So there's some very large forges, I think, in these Air Force related production lines. I think one in Cleveland. They do parts for, like, I'm just trying to think of what we're still forging in terms of using these heavy forges. And I understand it's sort of SpaceX rockets, aerospace.
Much more complicated than this. It's not just, first of all, it's not just the forging, right? Mm-hmm. You take the forging and then you're welding it together. So an RPV, for example, has three, a modern RPV maybe has three forged components and then has belt line welds around it, assembling it into one contiguous vessel, for example. But I think the actual issue is it's not just having the forge, it's having the ability for that forge to take what are called hot ingots that are literally poured from molten metal very close to the factory and then actually forged while they are still hot, literally,
Yeah.
glowing red. If you've ever seen a picture of these, they're generally glowing red when they're actually doing the forging work. There's also issues. I mean, this is where ASME end stamping, I think, is really is really indicated. The success of the steam and industrial revolution was highly dependent on the ASME boiler and pressure vessel code and the equivalent, the BPVC, and the equivalent codes in other nations, right? We forget about how actually, you read literature from the 1850s and 1860s, boiler explosions were happening all the time, right? Yeah. And even before we talked about nuclear energy, right, having actually societies like the American Society of Mechanical Engineering put the boiler and pressure vessel code together really assured safety. And I think that in terms of, there's all sorts of debates that I think are fair to have about when do you want an NQA1, ASME end stamped thing? Maybe you don't need it for some things that we currently require it. I think that's totally fair. I think I would be, I think most nuclear operators would agree with me that, on the RPV, on the reactor pressure vessel, you probably want that to be under the ASME NSTAMP program and the NQA1 AP programs. But that's a debate for another time. So I think those are the three things that we're looking at. The last thing I'll just say is it's not just, can they do it? It's the track record of whether they can do it. We forget that, the Le Creusot Forge in Saint Michel or in France, right, had all sorts of quality issues. I'm not so sure they were so as big as the French regulator made them into be. I haven't looked into this very extensively, but the quality record of making these components is really, really important for a customer to consider. It's not just can they do it, it's can they do it at the quality and at the schedule that I want them to do. So I think, once again, we really do have, on the bright side of things, we have between Doosan, JSW, and MHI, the quality, I think, of the French components is very, very high at this point. I think the sort of Le Creusot, Saint Michel, Chalon sort of vertical complex is quite high quality at this point. I know people who have bought from them and are extremely satisfying. So I think the answer here is, just as the United States seeded the quality in those forges and those industrial complexes decades ago, we're going to want the tech transfer back. And I think, policy should be aligned to that.
And when you say seeded, you're talking about sprinkling seeds, not CEDED or...
Oh, sorry. Yes. Like literally yes. like a plant, like we forget that Framatome, right, which owned that Saint Michel, Chalon, Le Creusot capability, right? That Framatome stands for French American Atomic Constructors, right? Westinghouse owned 40% of that complex. Yeah. And it is based on U.S. technology transfer from Westinghouse that basically defines the entire basis of the French nuclear fleet. Same thing with, of course, the Team Korea, which was seeded completely by a tech transfer from combustion engineering, right, from the System 80 architecture that was transferred to the Koreans. And of course, the JSW MHI complex is both a combination of the General Electric reactors that were built under license by the Japanese, as well as the Mitsubishi pressurized water reactors that were under license again from Westinghouse. So we see that the U.S. ceded this transportation, this capability. Let's get it back now.
And I guess there's enough flexibility with tariffs for iPhones and other vital elements that you could import.
I'm smart enough not to comment on tariff cut policy on a public podcast, but I think that there's flexibility, and I'll leave it at that.
Right. Okay, so to sum it up, you're saying we shouldn't wait for an indigenous supply chain in the U.S. To get moving, but with enough orders, perhaps we can start to stand something up.
And once again, maybe an example of this would be maybe you how do I want to say this? How about maybe the tariff supply are waived for the first 3 or 4 RPVs, and maybe this is a perfect example of where tariffing could be good policy. On the 5th RPV, you say, you know what, you guys have had the time to do this. If you're going to build these reactors, You need to build some U.S. capacity. I don't think that's unreasonable. And I'll just add that, once again, showing the continuity in nuclear policy, the Biden administration under the Inflation Reduction Act did actually have a 10% adder on the investment tax credit for a domestic supply chain.
Right. Okay. Anything else to add again on this grand strategy, best practices deployment of AP1000s?
So I think that once again, we want to be really positive here. And, I was making, once again, I was joking with good fun, with Jigger's sort of policy. But I think really at this point, it is necessary to figure out, unless we're going to have a utility organization commit to building 6 of those 8 or 8 of those 8, this is a place where, one, this administration really does need to figure out how do we figure out how a developer really plays a role in delivering those AP1000s. 2, I love the idea, and I hope I wasn't in any case in the earlier time, somehow negative on this. The idea of advanced procurement here is a really smart idea. This is what we want. It needs to be done smartly. And it's a very, figuring out how nuclear procurement is done well, something that is incredibly challenging, but can be done and has been done in history. I personally think that looking at the models that were done where things have gone right in nuclear construction over the last couple decades, particularly if you look at steam generator replacements, these are started at 18 months, now we're down to 26 days, right? Figuring out the sort of the magic of how that does. I know that's something our company really has a lot of experience that we hired on from that world, and we replicate a lot of what we do based on how we actually how companies like Bechtel and SGT got so good at steam generator replacements, including on procurement management. We forget that in a steam generator replacement, for example, the procurement really can't be late, because if it's late, you miss a refueling outage window, and your 18 to 24 months slipped, not 2 or 3 months slipped, right? So there are real best practices that I think organizations are building up right now in the industry, not just ours, but there are other companies that are really building this skill set, concentrating under one house. I think that we want to see the U.S. government working with utilities, figure out how do we actually make sure that they're involved in new AP1000 bills. And then the third thing I think really is facilitating, I think, credible offtake that can support, the high price that we're initially going to see on these AP1000s. I think there's a lot of worry early on in this administration that the lower emphasis on zero carbon and decarbonization was going to sort of evaporate the demand and price signal for nuclear energy. I don't think that this administration, to their credit, is proving that worry to be justified. So I think, working with private industry and figuring out how do we actually build a demand catalog of 1.1 or 2.2 gigawatts of capacity and bring that all together on one house, and working with our utility counterparties. I know a lot of us are actually in those conversations right now, and figuring out how the U.S. government can play a catalytic role there, I think is the third missing piece here, to really make this an attractive opportunity for companies to go and build new AP1000s or ABWRs or other reactor types of the large reactor variety. I think we're in an interesting place. I'll just end at this, right? Where we have, I think, real movement. We talk about large light water reactors, but in reality, there's movement on the SMR front as well. Whether that's BWX 300s being built down in, we just saw the recent announcement of a couple $100 million going to BWX 300 development, another couple $100 million going to Holtec to develop the SMR 300. So this is a real and will likely a build at Palisades for new SMRs. And even we saw the construction permit issued for the TerraPower reactor in Kemmerer. So this is a real moment where, once again, we're doing it. This is happening now. It's no longer a bunch of guys on podcasts talking about this happening. The question that I think I and all of my colleagues in the industry need to be keeping themselves up at night is how do we make sure that we don't clench defeat from the jaws of victory, that we've come so far in actually getting to this very exciting moment where there is real movement, there is real demand, there's real price signals being sent by the market that new nuclear is extremely, extremely attractive. How do we make sure that this is different than the naughties, than the first nuclear renaissance? And how do we as a community and as a industry together work to make sure that we're learning from our mistakes rather than repeating them?
I think that's a great place to leave it, James.
Thanks
again. We'll see you next time.
Today's episode was made possible through a generous donation from the Xerxes Foundation and from listeners like you making pledges on our Substack. If you'd like to join the tribe, please do head over to our Substack, smash that pledge button, or if you would like a tax-deductible receipt, you can hit the donate button and make a contribution through our fiscal sponsor. We genuinely appreciate your support. It is only through your generosity that we're able to continue to offer energy literacy on demand.